Ever wondered what lies beneath the glamour of a billionaire's life? A buried family secret, an innocent word that changes everything, and a journey to reclaim honor in a world of power and traps. Don't miss out. Hit like and subscribe to uncover the story now. William Carver stood alone in the penthouse office of Carver Tech's Manhattan headquarters, the city's skyline sprawling beneath him like a glittering tapestry of ambition. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls framed, a view most men would kill for, towers of steel and light stretching into the night, a testament to the empire he'd built over 3 decades. At 58, he wore success like the bespoke charcoal suit clinging to his broad shoulders, but tonight, the weight of it felt heavier than usual. His right hand cradled a crystal tumbler of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the glow of the desk lamp. His fingers trembled faintly, not from age, but from something deeper, something he'd buried long ago. He took a sip, the burn sliding down his throat, sharp and familiar. It didn't warm the hollow space in his chest. 30 years at the top, and what did he have to show for it? A corner office, a private jet, a name etched in the annals of tech innovation. But no one waited for him at home. No laughter echoed through the sprawling Carver estate upstate. The silence was his only companion now, a relentless reminder of choices made in the name of honor, or what he'd once convinced himself was honor. The memory came unbidden, as it often did on nights like this. Anna Delaney's face flickered. In his mind, her warm smile, the way her green eyes lit up when she laughed, the softness of her voice in that cramped Brooklyn apartment they'd shared for a fleeting summer. She'd been his first love, his only love, if he were honest. 30 years ago, in a dingy diner off Flatbush Avenue, she'd looked at him across a chipped formica table and said, "I'm pregnant, Will." Her voice had trembled, not with fear, but with hope. And he'd frozen. The Carver name, the expectations of his father, the looming shadow of a legacy he was meant to uphold, they'd all pressed down on him like a vice. He'd left $500 on the table, muttered an apology, and walked out into the rain, choosing the boardroom over the cradle. He hadn't looked back, not then. But now, standing in this sterile tower of glass and steel, the regret clawed at him. What had he traded her for? A life of meetings and mergers, of shaking hands with men who'd stab him in the back for a better deal. He set the tumbler down on the mahogany desk, the clink loud in the stillness. Beside it sat his father's old gold watch, its relentless ticking a metronome to his thoughts. Time didn't care about his wealth or his titles. It just kept moving, leaving him behind. The phone buzzed, shattering the quiet. William glanced at the screen. Margaret Voss, his assistant of 20 years. He answered with a curt, "What is it, Maggie?" "Trouble at the Jersey plant," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "Line 3's down and the workers are threatening to walk out. You need to go down there, sir. If the press gets wind of this..." "Fine." He cut her off, rubbing his temple. "Have the car ready." He didn't visit the factories often. Those were the domain of middle managers and foremen. But Maggie was right. A strike now, with the company under scrutiny from shareholders, could spiral into a PR nightmare. He grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator, the whiskey still burning in his throat. The drive to Jersey took nearly an hour, the city's lights fading into the gray sprawl of industrial lots and sagging row houses. William sat in the back of the Bentley, staring out at the passing streets. They reminded him of Anna's old neighborhood, the cracked sidewalks, the flickering streetlights, the stubborn resilience of people who had nothing but kept going anyway. He'd promised her a house once, a real one with a porch and a yard. Instead, he'd given her silence. The factory loomed ahead, a hulking mass of concrete and steel, its smokestacks puffing white plumes into the night. Shouts greeted him as he stepped out, his polished shoes sinking into the oily gravel. Workers milled around, their voices sharp with frustration, while a fire truck's siren wailed in the distance. The plant manager rushed over, sweating despite the March chill. "Minor chemical leak, sir. We've got it under control, but the union's stirring trouble." William nodded, his face a mask of calm authority. "Handle it," he said, striding toward the main building. He'd deal with the details later. For now, he needed to show his face, remind them who was in charge. But as he passed the break room, a sound stopped him cold. A child's cry, soft and insistent, cutting through the clamor. He turned. In the corner, beneath a flickering fluorescent light, a young woman knelt beside a little girl, maybe 3 years old. The woman wore a faded Carver Tech jumpsuit, her brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail, her face etched with exhaustion. The child, with golden curls and flushed cheeks, clung to her, sobbing. William's instinct was to keep moving. Personal matters didn't belong here. But the girl broke free and toddled toward him, her tiny hands grabbing at his trouser leg. "You look like the man in Mommy's picture," she said, her voice clear and bright despite the tears. Her green eyes, Anna's eyes, stared up at him, wide and trusting. William froze. The air seemed to thicken, the noise of the factory fading into a dull hum. The woman, Emily, her name tag read, scrambled, over, pulling the girl back. "Lily, stop it! I'm so sorry, sir, she's just tired," she stammered, her gaze darting away from his. But Lily wasn't done. "Mommy says he's somebody's daddy," she chirped, pointing at him. The words hit like a punch. William's chest tightened, his breath catching. He forced himself to stay composed, years of boardroom discipline holding him steady. "What picture?" he asked, his voice low, sharper than he intended. Emily flinched, clutching Lily closer, but she didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any explanation. He turned on his heel and walked back to the car, his pulse hammering. The driver opened the door, but William barely noticed. His mind raced, piecing together fragments he'd tried to forget. Anna, a child, a past he'd buried under layers of success. As the Bentley pulled away, Lily's voice echoed in his head, a whisper from the dark he couldn't ignore. Whatever. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Bentley's engine hummed as it cut through the Jersey night, but William Carver barely registered the sound. His hands rested on his knees, fingers clenched into fists, the knuckles whitening against the dark wool of his trousers. Lily's words, "You look like the man in Mommy's picture," looped in his mind, each repetition tightening the knot in his chest. He'd walked away from the factory with the same measured stride he used in boardrooms, his face a mask of calm, but inside, a storm raged. 30 years of burying Anna Delaney hadn't prepared him for this. A child's voice slicing through the armor he'd built around his past. He glanced out the window. The industrial sprawl gave way to the faint glow of Manhattan on the horizon, a beacon of the life he'd chosen. But tonight, it felt like a mirage. Emily's face lingered in his thoughts. Those tired eyes, the way she'd pulled Lily close, shielding her from him, and Lily herself. Those green eyes, so much like Anna's, bright with innocence and something else. Recognition, accusation. He couldn't tell. All he knew was that he needed answers, and he needed them now. Back at the penthouse, the elevator, doors slid open with a soft chime. William stepped into the office, the city lights casting long shadows across the polished floor. He shrugged off his coat, letting it fall over the leather armchair, and poured another whiskey. The burn was sharper this time, grounding him. He picked up the phone and dialed Margaret Voss. "Maggie," he said when she answered, his voice steady despite the chaos beneath it. "I need you to do something for me, discreetly." "Sir?" Her tone was cautious, practiced after years of handling his demands. "There's a woman at the Jersey plant, Emily Harris. She's got a daughter, Lily. I want an ADN test run on the girl. Use whatever contacts you need, but keep it quiet. No one else knows." A pause stretched on the line. "ADN, sir. Are you sure?" "Do it," he cut in, his grip tightening, on the tumbler. "I'll handle the rest." He hung up before she could press further. Maggie was loyal, ruthlessly so, but she'd ask questions later. For now, he trusted her to move fast. He sank into the desk chair, the gold watch ticking beside him like a heartbeat. What was he doing? Digging into a stranger's life over a child's babble? But it wasn't just babble. Lily's words had landed like a stone in still water, rippling through decades of denial. The next morning, William arrived at the factory unannounced. The air smelled of oil and metal, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of his office. Workers glanced his way, their murmurs fading as he passed. He found Emily in the break room, alone this time, scrubbing a coffee stain from her jumpsuit. She looked up, startled, and her expression hardened. "Mr. Carver," she said, straightening. "What do you want?" He kept his distance, hands in his pockets, his posture deliberate. "I owe you an apology for yesterday. I didn't mean to upset your daughter." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face. "Lily's fine. She says things. She's 3. It doesn't mean anything. Doesn't it?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it. "She mentioned a picture. I'd like to see it." Emily froze, her hands gripping the rag. For a moment he thought she'd bolt, but she squared her shoulders instead. "It's none of your business," she said, her tone sharp but steady. "I don't know what you think you're doing coming down here like this, but my family's not your concern." William didn't flinch. He'd faced down CEOs and politicians without blinking, and he wouldn't let this rattle him. But her words stung. Family, a word he'd stripped from his vocabulary long ago. "I'm not here to interfere," he said, meeting her gaze. "But if there's something I need to know, I'd rather hear it from you." She hesitated, then reached into her locker and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a faded photo, holding it just out of his reach. This is what she meant. "It's my late partner, James. Lily thinks every man in a suit looks like him." William took the photo when she finally offered it, his fingers brushing hers for a split second. The image was creased, the colors dulled by time, but the face staring back at him stopped his breath. James Delaney, tall, dark-haired, with a quiet intensity in his eyes. Anna's eyes. The resemblance was unmistakable, a ghost from the past, captured in a stranger's features. His hand trembled, but he steadied it, years of discipline kicking in. "Who was he?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily snatched the photo back, tucking it away. "James was my everything. He died 2 years ago, truck accident. Worked construction, dreamed of being an engineer, but we never had the money. That's all you need to know." William nodded, his mind racing. James Delaney. Anna's name. It couldn't be coincidence. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words automatic but sincere. "Thank you for showing me." She didn't respond, just turned back to her task, dismissing him. He left the break room, the photo burned into his memory. Outside, he leaned against the Bentley, the cold air biting his face. James had to be Anna's son, his son. The math fit. The eyes fit, and Lily was his granddaughter. The realization hit like a quiet thunderclap, shaking the foundations of the life he'd built. He climbed into the car, his expression unreadable. "Back to the city," he told the driver, his voice calm, authoritative. But inside, his heart pounded. He wouldn't confront Emily again, not yet. He'd wait for the ADN results, let the truth come in its own time. For now, he'd hold his composure, as he always had, even as the past crept closer. Whatever Lily's words had unleashed, he'd face it with the dignity he'd spent a lifetime cultivating. Anything less would betray the man he'd become, and the man he'd failed to be. William Carver sat in the dim glow of his upstate estate, the Carver family mansion sprawling around him like a mausoleum of forgotten promises. The penthouse had felt too small tonight, its glass walls too exposed, so he'd driven north to this relic of his lineage, a sprawling stone edifice perched on a bluff overlooking the Hudson River. The library, with its oak-paneled walls and towering bookshelves, smelled of leather and time. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows over the room, but it did little to warm the chill that had settled into his bones. He held the tumbler of whiskey loosely, the amber liquid, untouched since he'd poured it an hour ago. Beside him, on the antique side table, lay his father's gold watch, its steady ticking a quiet rebuke. The photo Emily had shown him haunted his thoughts. James Delaney's face, those green eyes so like Anna's, staring out from a faded snapshot. It wasn't just resemblance, it was certainty. James had been his son, and Lily, that bright-eyed child tugging at his trouser leg, was his granddaughter. The truth pressed against his ribs, heavy and unyielding, but William kept his breathing even, his face still. Years of boardroom battles had taught him to mask turmoil, and he wouldn't falter now. The memories came then, uninvited, but inevitable. Anna Delaney's laughter echoed in his mind, soft and clear as it had been 30 years ago in that cramped Brooklyn apartment. He could still see her standing by the window, rain streaking the glass, her hands deftly working a pair of knitting needles. "It's for the baby," she'd said, smiling as she held up a tiny sweater, its wool a soft blue. He'd kissed her then, promising a house, a life, a future he'd never intended to keep. The Carver name had demanded more. His father's stern voice, Henry's cold ambition, the weight of a legacy that brooked no weakness. When Anna told him she was pregnant, fear had gripped him, not of fatherhood, but of failure. He'd left, her in that diner, $500 and a hollow apology, his only farewell. William's grip tightened on the tumbler, but he didn't drink. He set it down, the clink against the wood a deliberate sound in the silence. What had become of her after that? He'd never checked, not once. He'd told himself she'd moved, on found someone else, built a life without him. But Emily's words at the factory, "He died 2 years ago. We never had the money," painted a different picture. Anna had raised James alone, likely in the same poverty he'd fled from. And now James was gone, leaving Lily behind. The chain of loss stretched back to that rainy night, every link forged by his own hands. He rose and crossed to the fireplace, resting a hand on the mantel. The heat stung his skin, but he welcomed it, a tether to the present. Above the hearth hung a portrait of his father, stern and unyielding, the man who'd drilled honor into him as a boy. "A Carver doesn't bend," he'd said, his voice like iron. William had lived by that creed, building Carver Tech into a titan of industry, but at what cost? The honor he'd chased had been a hollow shell, gilded with wealth and power, while the real dignity, the kind Anna had carried in her quiet strength, had slipped through his fingers. The phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back. It was Margaret Voss, he answered, his voice steady. "Yes? The ADN results are in, sir," she said, her tone clipped but hesitant. "I had them expedited, as you asked. They're on your desk in the city." "And?" He kept his tone, neutral, though his pulse quickened. A pause. "The girl, Lily, she's your granddaughter. James Delaney was your son." William closed his eyes, the confirmation landing like a stone in his chest. He'd known it, felt it, but hearing it aloud made it real. "Thank you, Maggie," he said, his voice unshaken. "I'll handle it from here." He hung up and stood motionless, the fire's warmth fading against the cold certainty settling over him. His son was dead. Anna was gone. How long ago? He didn't know. And Lily, this child he'd met by chance, was all that remained of the life he'd abandoned. The weight of it should have broken him, but William straightened his shoulders, years of discipline holding him upright. He wouldn't crumble. Not now. Not when there was something left to do. He returned to the chair, picking up the tumbler again. This time he took a slow sip, letting the burn steady his nerves. The whiskey was a ritual, a way to center himself, before a fight. And this was a fight, not with fists or fury, but with the past he'd created. He thought of Emily, her fierce protectiveness, her refusal to let him near Lily. She didn't trust him, and why should she? To her he was just another suit, a man with money but no soul. But she didn't know the half of it, didn't know the regret that had gnawed at him for decades, the nights he'd lain awake wondering what might have been. The fire popped, sending a spark skittering across the hearth. William's gaze drifted to the knitting needles Anna had used, a memory so vivid he could almost feel the wool beneath his fingers. She'd deserved better. Better than him. Better than the silence he'd left her with. And James? What had his life been like? A boy with dreams of engineering, crushed by the same poverty William had escaped. The guilt was a quiet ache, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. He'd face it, as he'd faced every challenge with the dignity he'd spent a lifetime honing. He set the tumbler down and stood, the decision forming like steel in his spine. He'd go back to Emily, not with demands or arrogance, but with the truth. Whatever it cost him, his reputation, his company, his pride, he'd bear it, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Because honor, he realized now, wasn't the Carver name or the empire he'd built. It was the courage to own his mistakes, to stand tall in the shadows of memory, and to fight for the family he'd lost. For the first time in 30 years, William felt the flicker of something real, a purpose worth more than gold. William Carver stood outside Emily Harris's apartment building, a squat brick structure on the edge of Jersey City, its chipped paint and sagging awnings a world away from his Manhattan penthouse. The late March wind tugged at his overcoat, carrying the faint tang of exhaust and damp earth. He'd driven here alone, the Bentley parked a block away to avoid drawing eyes. The ADN results burned in his pocket, a folded sheet of paper that confirmed what his heart had already whispered. Lily was his granddaughter, James his son. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed to hear it from Emily, to face the past he'd buried and the family he'd left behind. He climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, each step creaking under his weight. The hallway smelled of stale coffee and mildew, a faint hum of television chatter seeping through thin walls. Apartment 3B's door was weathered, its brass, number tarnished. He knocked, the sound firm but measured, his pulse steady despite the storm brewing inside. Years of facing down corporate sharks had taught him to keep his hands still, his face calm, even when the ground shifted beneath him. Emily opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness in an instant. She wore a faded sweater over her Carver Tech jumpsuit, her brown hair loose around her shoulders. Behind her, Lily sat on a threadbare rug, stacking blocks with fierce concentration. The apartment was small, a sagging couch, a kitchenette with chipped counters, but it felt lived in, warm in a way William's estate never had. "Mr. Carver," Emily said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he replied, keeping his tone even, hands in his pockets. "It's important." She hesitated, then stepped aside, her reluctance palpable. 5 minutes. Lily's bedtime soon. He nodded and entered, the door clicking shut behind him. The air carried a hint of lavender, likely from the candle flickering on a side table. Lily glanced up, her green eyes, Anna's eyes, lighting with recognition. "Hi, suit man," she chirped, waving a block. William's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through his reserve, but he turned his focus to Emily. "I know who James was," he said, his voice low but firm. "He was my son. Lily's my granddaughter. I had tests done." Emily's face went pale, her hands clenching at her sides. For a moment she said nothing, the silence thick between them. Then her eyes blazed. "You had no right," she snapped, her voice trembling but controlled. "You don't get to waltz in here throwing money at tests, acting like you own us." "I didn't come to own anyone," William said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I came to understand, to take responsibility." "Responsibility?" She laughed, a bitter sound that cut deeper than he'd expected. "Where was that when my mother needed it? When James needed it? Anna raised him alone, worked herself, sick in a factory just like yours, coughing up blood in a hospital bed while you sat in your tower counting billions." The words landed like blows, each one testing his composure. He saw Anna in his mind, her hands raw from labor, her smile fading in a sterile ward, and the guilt surged, hot and sharp. But he didn't lash out. He'd spent a lifetime mastering himself, and he wouldn't lose that now. "Tell me," he said, his voice steady despite the ache. "Tell me what happened to her." Emily crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "She died 15 years ago. Cancer. James was 16. She never told him who his father was, just said you were a man who made choices. I met him later after she was gone. He was kind, stubborn, wanted to build things, bridges, buildings. But he died before he could, and I've been keeping Lily safe ever since. That's my job, not yours. William nodded, absorbing the weight of her story. Anna's death, James's loss. It was a ledger of failures, all traced back to that. Diner table 30 years ago. He opened his mouth to respond when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out. Margaret Voss. "Excuse me," he said, stepping toward the window. "Sir," Maggie's voice was tense. "There's something you need to know. Anna wrote to you, 10 years back. A letter begging for help with James's medical bills. I intercepted it, burned it. I thought it'd ruin you. Ruin Carver Tech." William's breath caught, his hand tightening on the phone. The city lights blurred beyond the grimy glass, a distant hum of betrayal ringing in his ears. Maggie, loyal, efficient Maggie, had buried Anna's plea, and with it, any chance he'd had to save his son. Anger flared, bright and fierce, but he clamped it down, his voice ice-cold when he spoke. "You had no right to decide that for me, Maggie. But I don't blame you. I made you what you are. We'll talk later." He hung up, turning back to Emily. She watched him, her eyes sharp, waiting. "That was my assistant," he said, his tone measured. "Anna reached out to me once. I never knew. Someone hid it, thinking they were protecting me." Emily's expression softened, just for a second, then hardened again. "Doesn't change anything. You weren't there." "No," he agreed, the admission raw but calm. "I wasn't, but I'm here now. I don't expect forgiveness, Emily. I don't even deserve it. But Lily, she's my blood. I want to help, however you'll let me." She studied him, her silence. A wall he couldn't breach. Finally, she said, "I need time. This doesn't mean you're in our lives. Not yet." He nodded, respecting her boundary. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." He left the apartment, the door closing softly behind him. The stairwell felt narrower now, the air heavier. Maggie's confession gnawed at him, another layer of soil over the secrets he'd sown. But he didn't rage or despair. He walked, to the Bentley with the same steady gait he'd used all his life, the wind cold against his face. This wasn't about absolution. It was about accountability. Whatever came next, he'd face it with the dignity he'd rediscovered, not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the quiet courage of a mother and the innocent voice of a child. William Carver stood in the boardroom of Carver Tech's Manhattan headquarters, the city's skyline a stark backdrop through the towering windows. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights, surrounded by a dozen suits, men and women who'd built their fortunes on his vision. But today, their eyes weren't on the quarterly reports or the latest tech rollout. They were on him, sharp and calculating, as Henry Carver, his older brother and chairman of the board, paced at the head of the room, his silver hair catching the light like a crown. "You've lost your edge, William," Henry said, his voice a low growl, laced with the arrogance of a man who'd never doubted his place. "This distraction with some factory workers, kid, it's a liability. The stock's already jittery after the Jersey fiasco. Now rumors are swirling about a secret granddaughter. You're dragging the Carver name through the mud." William kept his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid but calm. The ADN results and Maggie's confession still burned in his mind, but he'd locked the turmoil away, his face a mask of quiet authority. He'd expected this. Henry had always been the family's enforcer, wielding shame like a weapon. "The rumors are true," William said, his tone steady. "Her name's Lily. She's my granddaughter. I intend to acknowledge her." A murmur rippled through the room, sharp intakes of breath and sidelong glances. Henry stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "You intend to what? You think this board will sit by while you play house with some bastard's brat? The press will eat us alive. CEO's love child scandal rocks tech giant. You'll tank us and I won't let that happen." The words stung. Bastard, brat. Each a jab at Lily, at James, at Anna. William's chest tightened, a flicker of anger threatening to break through. but he crushed it down. He'd spent decades mastering himself, through hostile takeovers, through his father's tirades, and he wouldn't falter now. Her mother's name was Anna Delaney, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I left her 30 years ago. That was my mistake, not hers, not James's, not Lily's. I'm done running from it. Henry scoffed, slamming a hand on the table. You're done running? You're just starting to sink us. I've called an emergency vote. If you push this, you're out. No one here wants a sentimental fool at the helm. William met his brother's gaze, unflinching. Henry's face, lined with years of entitlement, was a mirror of their father's. But where? The old man had demanded loyalty. Henry craved control. Do what you have to, William said. But I'm not here to beg for your approval. I'm here to tell you what's coming. He left the boardroom without another word, the door closing softly behind him. The hallway stretched ahead, its marble floor gleaming under recessed lights, but his steps felt heavier now. Henry's threat wasn't idle. The board could oust him, and the press was already sniffing around. A junior assistant had tipped Maggie off that morning. A tabloid had caught wind of CEO Carver's secret family, and it was only a matter of hours before the story broke. William drove to Jersey City, the Bentley's hum a steady counterpoint to his racing thoughts. He needed to see Emily, not to demand but to warn her. The media storm would hit her hardest, and she deserved to know. He parked outside her building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The stairs creaked as he climbed, the familiar scent of mildew greeting him. At her door. He knocked, and this time Emily answered with less surprise, more resignation. Mr. Carver, she said, stepping aside. You're persistent. Inside, Lily napped on the couch, a worn blanket tucked around her small frame. Emily stood by the kitchenette, arms crossed, her eyes wary. What now? She asked. William stayed near the door, hands in his pockets. I told my board about Lily, he said, his voice low. They're not happy. The press will be next. Rumors are already out there. It'll get loud, Emily. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Her jaw tightened, a flicker of fear crossing her face before she masked it. Great. So now I'm a headline. Poor single mom drags down billionaire. I didn't ask for this. I know, he said, keeping his tone even. And I'm sorry. I'm trying to fix what I broke, not make it worse. But I won't deny her. Not anymore. She studied him, her silence heavy. Then she moved to the couch, brushing a curl from Lily's forehead with a tenderness that pierced William's calm. She's all I have, Emily said, her voice soft but firm. James wanted her to have a good life, safe, quiet. Not this. William nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. I can't undo the noise, he said. But I can protect you both, however you'll let me. Money, a new place, whatever you need. I don't want your money, she snapped, her eyes flashing. I want my daughter to sleep without cameras at our door. I'll handle the press, he said, his resolve hardening. They won't touch her, I promise you that. She didn't reply, just turned back to Lily, her hand resting on the girl's shoulder. William took it as his cue to leave. He stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him, and pulled out his phone. Maggie, he said when she answered. Call the PR team. We're going public. My terms. Set a press conference for tomorrow. Sir, are you sure? Maggie's voice was tight. Henry's mobilizing the board. Let him, William cut in. I'm done hiding. He hung up and leaned against the wall, the cold brick grounding. Him. Henry's words echoed. Sentimental fool. But they didn't shake him. This wasn't sentiment. It was duty. The board could strip his title. The press could shred his name. But he'd face it all with the same quiet strength he'd honed. Over decades, he thought of Lily asleep on that couch, of Anna's unseen struggles, of James's broken dreams. They deserved more than his silence. Back in the Bentley, he watched the city lights flicker to life, a tapestry of power he'd once ruled. Now, it felt distant, irrelevant. The real fight wasn't in boardrooms or headlines. It was here, in the choice to stand for something beyond himself. He'd lost Anna and James to his pride, but Lily was still within reach. Whatever pressure came from above, he'd bear it, not with anger but with the dignity of a man finally claiming his own. The press conference room at Carver Tech's headquarters buzzed with anticipation, a sea of cameras and microphones poised like a firing squad. William Carver stood at the podium, the harsh glare of spotlights bleaching the lines of his face. Behind him, the company logo, a sleek silver C, loomed large, a symbol of the empire he'd built. The air smelled of coffee and static, the murmur of reporters a low hum beneath the pounding in his chest. He wore a tailored navy suit, his tie knotted with precision, but tonight it felt less like armor and more like a shroud. This wasn't a corporate announcement, it was a reckoning. He adjusted the microphone, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes locked on him, some curious, some predatory. Henry sat in the front row, arms crossed, his smirk a silent dare. William had seen the headlines that morning. Carver Tech CEO's secret family exposed. The tabloids had pounced, spinning half-truths into scandal, but he'd refused to let them write the story. This was his to tell. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm, resonant, cutting through the tension. "I'm here to address the rumors about my personal life. They're not entirely wrong, but they're not the whole truth either." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. He paused, letting them settle, then continued. 30 years ago, I walked away from a woman I loved, Anna Delaney. She was pregnant with my son, James. I didn't know him. I didn't help her raise him. She died 15 years ago, and James passed 2 years back in an accident. I failed, them both. But they left behind a daughter, Lily. My granddaughter. I've only just learned this, and I'm here to claim her, not as a liability, but as family. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, the rapid click of shutters. William stood still, his gaze fixed above the chaos, his breathing even. He'd rehearsed this, not to perfect the words, but to anchor himself against the storm. The truth was out now, raw and unvarnished, and he wouldn't flinch from it. He thought of Anna's green eyes, of James's face in that faded photo, of Lily's small hand tugging at his trouser leg. This was for them. A reporter in the back yelled, "Mr. Carver, are you stepping down over this?" Another chimed in. "What about the board's vote?" William raised a hand, silencing them with a quiet authority that needed no force. "I'm not here to discuss my job," he said, his tone firm but measured. "I'm here to set the record straight. Lily's mother, Emily Harris, has raised her alone. She's a good woman, a strong one, stronger than I ever was. They don't need my money or my name, but they have my promise. I'll stand by them, whatever comes." He paused, his throat tightening as Anna's memory surfaced, her singing softly in that rain-streaked apartment, her hands knitting a future he'd abandoned. His eyes stung, but he blinked it away, keeping his voice steady. "I've spent 30 years building Carver Tech, chasing a version of honor that meant power and prestige. I was wrong. Honor isn't in titles or wealth. It's in owning your mistakes and protecting the people you should have never let go. I'm sorry, Anna. I'm sorry, James. I'm here now." The room softened for a moment, a hush falling over the crowd. Then the doors at the back swung open and Emily stepped in, Lily in her arms. William's breath caught. She wore a simple gray coat, her face pale but resolute, her brown hair pulled back. Lily, wide-eyed, clutched a stuffed rabbit, her green gaze scanning the chaos. Reporters turned, cameras swiveling, but Emily didn't falter. She walked to the podium, her steps deliberate, and stopped beside him. The twist hit William like a quiet shock. She hadn't warned him she'd come. He'd expected her to stay away, to shield Lily from this circus. "Emily," he said under his breath, a question in his tone. She met his eyes, her voice low but fierce. "You don't get to do this alone." Then she faced the crowd, lifting her chin. "I'm Emily Harris. Lily's my daughter. Mr. Carver's telling the truth, she's his granddaughter. But we're not here for his money or his company. I just want her to know who her family is. That's it." The room exploded again, questions flying like shrapnel. "Ms. Harris, are you suing him? Is this a publicity stunt?" William stepped closer to her, a subtle shield, but Emily held her ground, her arm tightening around Lily. "No lawsuits," she said, her voice cutting through. "No stunts, just the truth." The reporters surged forward, but William raised a hand again, his presence a wall they couldn't breach. "That's all," he said. "No more questions." He glanced at Emily, a silent offer, and she nodded. Together they walked off the stage, Lily nestled between them, the cameras flashing in their wake. Backstage, in a quiet corridor lined with sleek panels, William turned to her. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice soft but raw. "I didn't want this for you." "I know," she replied, shifting Lily to her hip. "But she deserves to hear it from me, too. Not just the papers. And you didn't look like you'd back down." He managed a faint smile, the first in days. "I wouldn't have." She studied him, then nodded. "Good." Henry stormed in, his face red with fury. "You've ruined us," he spat, jabbing a finger at William. "The board's voting you out tonight. You're done." William didn't blink. "Then I'm done," he said, his voice calm, unshaken. "But I'm not ruined. You can have the chair, Henry. I've got something better." Henry sneered, but there was a flicker of something, envy maybe, in his eyes before he stalked off. William turned back to Emily and Lily. The girl yawned, rubbing her eyes, oblivious to the chaos she'd sparked. "Let's get you home," he said, his tone gentle. As they left, the weight of Carver slipped from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter, truer. The spotlight had burned, but it hadn't broken him. He'd stood tall, not with anger but with dignity, and for the first time, he felt like a man worthy of the family he'd reclaimed. The house by the Hudson River stood modest against the sprawling estates of Westchester County, its white clapboard siding weathered but sturdy, its porch overlooking the water's gentle flow. William Carver had bought it a week after the press conference, trading the cold grandeur of his upstate mansion for something smaller, something real. The penthouse was gone too, sold off to cover the fallout from his resignation. Carver's board, led by Henry, had voted him out that night, and the headlines had screamed for days. CEO steps down amid family scandal. But William felt no loss. The weight of titles had lifted, leaving room for something new. He sat on the porch, now a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, the early April air crisp against his face. The river glinted under the morning sun, a ribbon of silver winding through the trees. Inside, Emily and Lily were unpacking the last of their boxes. He'd offered them the house, not as charity, but as a home, after the press had swarmed. Their Jersey City apartment, cameras flashing through the windows. Emily had resisted at first, her pride a fortress, but when Lily started waking from nightmares about the loud people, she'd relented. "Just until it quiets down," she'd said, her voice firm but weary. The screen door creaked, and Lily bounded out, her golden curls bouncing. She wore a red sweater, too big for her small frame, something Emily must have found in storage. "Grandpa!" she chirped, climbing onto the chair beside him. The word still jolted him, a title he hadn't earned but longed to live up to. "Can we play checkers?" William smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "Sure, kiddo. Go get the board." She dashed back inside, her footsteps a soft patter on the hardwood. Emily followed, leaning against the doorframe, a dish towel slung over her shoulder. "She's got you wrapped around her finger already," she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "She's good at it," William replied, sipping his coffee. "Takes after her mother." Emily rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She'd softened since the press conference, not fully, not yet, but enough to let him in, inch by inch. He'd kept his promise. The PR team had quashed the worst of the media storm, redirecting focus to Carver's new leadership. Henry's smug face now graced the business pages, but William didn't care. His world was here, in this quiet house, with the family he'd never known he needed. Lily returned, dragging a battered checkerboard and a bag of pieces. William set his mug down and helped her arrange the game on the porch table, his large hands steady next to her small ones. "You go first," he said, and she grinned, moving a red piece with exaggerated care. He countered, keeping the pace slow, savoring the simplicity of it. The clack of wood, the breeze rustling the trees, the river's murmur in the distance. "Mommy says you're really old," Lily said, her eyes on the board. William chuckled, a rare sound that felt foreign but right. "She's not wrong. 58's pretty ancient to a 3-year-old. Emily snorted from the doorway. "I didn't say really old, just old enough to know better." He glanced at her, catching the glint of humor in her eyes. "Fair enough," he said, moving a black piece. "I'm learning." They played on, Lily chattering about her rabbit toy and a bird she'd seen by the river. William listened, nodding at the right moments, his mind drifting to Anna. She'd have loved this, watching her granddaughter grow, sharing these small joys. He'd found a box of her letters in the penthouse storage, unsent notes she'd written, to him over the years, full of love and quiet forgiveness. "I hope you're happy, Will," one read. "James is strong, like you." The words had undone him, but he'd read them all, each a thread pulling him back to her. Emily stepped onto the porch, settling into a wicker chair. "You're good with her," she said, her tone softer now. "I didn't expect that." "I didn't either," he admitted, watching Lily jump a piece with a triumphant giggle. "I never had the chance with James. I'm trying to get it right this time." She nodded, her gaze distant. "He'd have liked you, I think. He was stubborn, hated asking for help, but he had a big heart. When Lily was born, he'd sit up all night just watching her sleep. Said it was the best thing he'd ever done." William's throat tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I wish I'd known him. I wish I'd been there." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching. "Why weren't you?" The question hung between them, simple but loaded. He could have deflected, blamed his father, the Carver legacy, but that wasn't the truth she deserved. "I was afraid," he said, meeting her gaze. "Afraid of failing, of not being enough. I thought walking away was strength. It wasn't. It was cowardice." She didn't respond right away, just watched Lily move another piece. Then she said, "Takes guts to admit that. Most people don't." "I've had 30 years to figure it out," he replied, a wry edge to his voice. "Better late than never." Lily yawned, rubbing her eyes, and Emily stood. "Time for a nap, kiddo." She scooped the girl up, pausing by William. "Thanks for this, the house, the quiet. It's more than I expected." "You're welcome," he said, the words carrying a weight beyond the moment. She nodded and carried Lily inside, the screen door creaking shut. William stayed on the porch, the checkerboard still spread before him. The river flowed on, steady and unhurried, a mirror to the peace settling over him. He'd lost Carver Tech, but he'd gained this, a chance to rebuild, not with steel and glass, but with time and care. The elite world he'd ruled felt like a distant memory, replaced by the dignity of these small acts. A game, a conversation, a home. For the first time he understood what honor really meant. Not the Carver name, but the quiet strength to be here, now, for the ones who mattered. The late April sun hung low over the Jersey factory, casting golden streaks across the concrete lot where it all began. William Carver stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands in the pockets of a simple wool jacket. No suit today, no tie. The phi air buzzed with quiet chatter. The hum of machinery silenced for the occasion. Workers in Carver Tech jumpsuits mingled with local families, their faces lit with curiosity and pride. At the center of the lot, a small stage held a podium and a banner. The Anna Delaney Scholarship Fund. Today was its launch, a promise kept in the shadow of the empire he'd left behind. William watched as Emily stepped to the podium, Lily perched on her hip. Emily wore a navy dress, modest but sharp, her brown hair pinned back. Lily, in a yellow sundress, clutched her stuffed rabbit, her green eyes darting over the crowd. Emily adjusted the microphone, her voice steady as she spoke. "Thank you for coming. This fund is for kids like mine, kids who deserve a shot at their dreams. It's named for my mother, Anna, who gave everything for hers." The crowd applauded, a warm swell that carried across the lot. William felt a pang in his chest. Pride, yes, but also the ache of what might have been. Anna's letters, now tucked in a drawer by the river house, had guided this moment. "I want James to have a chance," she'd written in one, her handwriting, shaky but sure. William hadn't given James that chance, but he could give it to others, starting with Lily. Emily stepped aside, gesturing to him. "Mr. Carver has something to say." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some knew him as the ex-CEO, others as the man who'd owned this place. He climbed the steps, his gait steady, and took the podium. The sun warmed his face, a contrast to the cold spotlight of weeks past. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice clear, unhurried. "I'm here because of Anna Delaney. She was a woman I loved and lost 30 years ago. I walked away when she needed me, and that choice cost me a son I never knew, James. It cost Anna her health, her time. But it gave me Lily, my granddaughter, and a chance to do right." He paused, scanning the faces. Workers he'd once overlooked, families like Emily's, all listening now. "I built Carver Tech to prove something, to myself, to my family. I thought that was honor. I was wrong. Honor isn't in skyscrapers or stock prices. It's in the quiet things. Raising a child, keeping a promise, owning your failures. This fund is my promise, to Anna, to James, to every kid who dreams big. It's not charity, it's accountability." The applause came again, softer this time, more thoughtful. William stepped back, but Lily wriggled free from Emily and toddled to him. "Grandpa," she called, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She grabbed his hand, tugging him down to her level. "You're the best," she whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. Laughter rippled out, and William's throat tightened. He scooped her up, her small weight grounding him, and kissed her forehead. Emily joined them, a faint smile on her lips. "She's right," she said quietly. "You're doing okay." He nodded, the words sinking in. "So are you." The ceremony ended with a ribbon cutting, Lily wielding oversized scissors with Emily's help, William steadying her hands. The crowd dispersed, leaving the three of them by the stage. William carried Lily to the river house, the drive a quiet hum of tires. On asphalt, Emily sat beside him, her gaze on the passing trees, a peace settling between them. At home, the porch welcomed them with its familiar creak. William set Lily down, and she ran to chase a butterfly by the water's edge. He settled into a chair, the Hudson River glinting under the fading light. Emily brought out a tray, coffee for him, juice for Lily, and sat across from him. "You didn't have to give up everything," she said, her tone more curious than accusing. "I didn't," he replied, sipping the coffee. "I gave up what? Didn't matter. The company was Henry's game. I played it too long. This," he gestured to the house, to Lily laughing by the river. "This is what lasts." She nodded, her eyes on her daughter. James would have liked this place. He loved rivers, said they never stopped moving no matter what. William smiled faintly. "He got that from Anna. She was unstoppable, even when I wasn't there to see it." They sat in silence, the river's murmur filling the space. Lily returned, climbing into William's lap with a yawn. "Story?" she mumbled, nestling against him. He pulled a blanket from the chair, draping it over her, and began, his voice low and steady. "Once there was a girl who loved to sing." Emily watched, her expression softening. When Lily drifted off, she spoke. "I found a picture of James yesterday, him and me, right after Lily was born. He's smiling. I'll show you sometime." "I'd like that," William said, his voice thick. "I'd like to know him through you." She nodded, a quiet pact sealed. As dusk settled, William carried Lily inside, laying her on the couch. He returned to the porch, picking up Anna's letters from the table. The last one read, "Be Good to yourself, Will. You're worth it. He traced the words, a final whisper from the woman he'd loved, and felt a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He'd earned it. The river flowed on, steady and sure, a mirror to the man he'd become. Carver Tech was Henry's. Now the penthouse a memory. But William had built something better, a legacy of care, not cash. He'd face the board, the press, his own guilt. Not with rage, but with the dignity of a man who'd learned what honor truly meant. Lily's breath sighed against the quiet. Emily's presence a steady anchor nearby. For the first time in 30 years, William Carver was home, not in a place but in the family he'd fought to reclaim, and in the strength he'd found to stand tall.